Mission Chats with Jon Crowe.
Well, welcome to Mission Chats. Today, I have the privilege to have a conversation with someone who I got to know as a child. We were in boarding school together way back in the day in Côte d'Ivoire, and we've sort of kept in touch over the years. So, Warwick, it's a joy and a blessing to have you here. And I'm going to start us off as we usually do, just asking you to share your story, kind of the journey you've been on, that the Lord's been taking you on, how you got re-involved with missions, as it were, and how you've gotten to the point where you are now.
Yeah, well, thanks, John. So my background is I'm MK in Liberia, and my parents came in 1979 when I was 3. And then I did the very backwards journey in that I started off in the main city, and we were here for our first term. And during that term, my parents were approached to become part of a church plant further into the what we call upcountry, just means going north, really into the bush. And they agreed. They went and scoped the area out. And then after our first term, went straight up into a larger city in the far north of Liberia. We were there for about 18 months. And then we moved into a village where the village wanted us to come and live and minister to all the villages in the area that my dad was already involved in anyway. And so we moved from Monrovia, in the capital of Liberia, to a place called Kolahun, which is about 25,000 people at the time, and then to a village of 250 people. So other MKs that I've spoken to, they kind of start in the bush where their mum's been teaching them, and then they gradually move into the city to do high school. But I went quite opposite, but then we jumped across into boarding school.
Right.
But yeah, so I kind of went the backwards journey. And the only reason that we left Liberia in 1989 was because of the Civil War that started while I was in boarding school.
Right.
That's kind of background into my MK life. And then things got quite difficult from a, spiritual and emotional standpoint during that. When we were sitting in Abidjan, you guys were there at the time.
Yep.
So we were in this limbo, really.
Right.
Because we were waiting to see whether or not we would be allowed to go back to Liberia. My sister was coming from boarding school from England. But so we were waiting to get news whether or not we leave or where we stay. So she's on her flight and we get word that we're not going back. So she lands, we wait 3 days, and we all take off back to England again.
Wow.
So the end of my MK journey was very, very different. I was heading into grade 9 in high school, or year 9 in Australia, but I was doing year 9 in boarding school, which is the English curriculum. So I ended up having to redo year 9 in Australia because of just the different system. And you talk about being cranky or upset in a situation, but then you look back and go, you know what, that was probably the best thing that happened.
So often that's the case, isn't it?
Yeah, because the people that I became really good friends with were actually, there was about 8 of us that were in the same youth group that from the same year at school. So that was example of God knowing what he's doing, even though we might be upset about it at the time.
Right.
So then it wasn't too long later that my grandfather passed away when I was in year 10.
Okay.
And it was actually that weekend that there was a youth church group down in Canberra, in the Australian capital, that I went along to. And that was when kind of all the emotions of being an MK kind of went flowing over me. And it was there was a particular song that affected me at the time, Worthy is the Lamb. It was just one of those moments that kind of just flowed over me. It's like, whew, nearly 2 years after leaving Liberia, that I felt like I just left the whole place. I'd found myself a little place and thought I was hiding from everyone, but one of the leaders came and found me, and we had a good chat.
Yeah, those watershed moments, huh?
Yeah, they creep up on you. We put a lot of our emotions into a container, and then there's only so much pressure the container can take before it kind of comes out again.
Yeah. So how did the Lord lead you from that childhood experience, and obviously a big transition in your life, which I can relate to as well? What did your journey look like moving from that to where you are now?
Yeah, so after we got back to Australia in year 9, I was very much looking for every kind of news snippet of Liberia and the Civil War and things like that. The media kind of forgot about it, and in turn, I kind of forgot about it too. Maybe that probably my way of kind of dealing with things. But
Sure.
I still had the mind to look towards coming back to Africa in general to do work or to service. And so it was on my mind to do conservation work, but working mainly with animals. That was my focus.
Interesting.
You know, how can I get back to Africa kind of thing
Right.
was my mindset. It's like, oh, okay, if I do this and do this, and I can go and get a job there, and then I can go and live in Liberia. And, you know, I wanted to get into park ranging and stuff, conservation management. At that point, I was looking at Australia, really. I found one course to do that would have taken me like a 4-year journey to kind of get into this course that I wanted to. And like, this didn't enjoy this. So my first 6 months of college was, that was the adventurous year. I'm done with Christianity. Not so much done with it, but it's like, I'm just going to have fun, basically, is my kind of mindset. Even though I'd given my life to the Lord in that year that we talked about in year 10. But then, you know, college, there's band nights every Wednesday night. We'd go down to that, you know, the alcohol drinking and carrying on and stuff. But even though, again, you're looking back going, you know what? It was the time I, you know, got it out of the system or whatever.
Right. Sure.
Because I found, or my mum actually was looking for, she knew the course I was doing wasn't exactly what I wanted. And so I pushed into another course that ended up being Queensland, which is how we came and said hello to each other again up in Queensland, in Toowoomba, in the missions conference that was there. I took another year to finish the course. But then at the end of that, I went and worked for 6 months in Ghana. In the Nature Conservation and Research Center. So working on a little community managed hippo sanctuary in a little place called Wa. Well, the little village is called Wetchow. Wetchow Community Hippo Sanctuary.
Wow. It's a unique resume note.
Yeah. Well, my qualifications are an associate diploma in wilderness and wildlife reserves.
Okay. You said it was just a few months there at that point.
Yeah, so about 6 months. And so on my journey there, I stopped in Liberia for about 10 days.
Okay.
Now, this is in 1999. There was peaceful at the time, but about 6 months later, it just blew up into the World War III that they talk about. And so the civil war in Liberia actually ramped up to horrible things happening to the people, both in Sierra Leone at the time as well, because they had the same civil war going on, and Liberia. That was when what the Liberians here called World War III started. It was just chaos where they ended up being like 8 different warring factions.
Wow.
And during the time, doing all sorts of horrible things, you know. So I actually hitched a ride with some missionary friends that were here, and they were heading to Cote d'Ivoire. So I went back to Cote d'Ivoire and flew on to Ghana to work there. So got back to Australia in the middle of 99. My wife and I, we got married about nearly 2 years later.
Okay.
But we'd only started dating correspondently while I was in Ghana. You know, it's one of those things where we were good friends. Our friendship grew over the years or whatever, but then we got to know each other a lot through letter correspondence. You know, imagine writing a letter these days.
I know. It's unheard of now.
So once we got back, we really explored our relationship and got married in 2001.
Okay.
And we actually often joke that it was a condition of marriage that we would go into mission. So she's a preacher's kid. So we have PK and an MK.
Right.
We knew that we'd be doing something. And it really settled on our heart in about 2012. We had the 3 girls that we have. And just to backtrack a little bit, the church that we had decided to join, the minister for that place who came and visited us and said, yeah, it's great to have you on board and stuff like that. And came to our house for tea and had lunch at their place. And then when we actually said, right, this is going to be our home church, they invited us to the church weekend away like 2 weeks later. It's like, oh, you might as well come along. I'm like, sure, no problem. And it was at that weekend away that they announced that they were going into missions in Mexico. And we're like, we just joined your church because of your preaching, and now you're leaving us. What's going on? But it was actually at that point when the mother approached me and said, hey, do you have any advice for me as a mom taking kids into an MK situation? And I talked about the compartment where you just jam stuff in.
Right.
And that question started to open things up. I'm like, oh, what is going on? Because I compartmentalized so much of it.
Yeah.
And it was then that I just, I need to sort something out with this. So I went and saw a psychologist for about 6 months.
Okay.
And processing through a lot of what was happening at that time and what I'd been dealing with from the way in which I left Liberia,
Right.
because
Yeah.
I didn't say goodbye to all of my friends. I
Mm-hmm.
left to go to boarding school, and that was the last time I saw many of them.
Yeah.
And up until, while we've been in mission in Liberia as a family, several people have come out of the woodwork that I thought had died during the war, including my oldest Liberian friend here that I met when we first got here in '79.
Wow.
He must have been 5 or something, and I was 4 when we were just hanging out all the time. But yeah, alive and well and
Yep.
kicking. It's
Yeah. So the Lord
crazy.
led you back to serve him in Liberia, right? That's where you are now. And tell me about that.
Yeah. Yeah. So what I ended up doing here is a SIM projects coordinator. Projects within to what the missionaries have. So, we have, nearly $1 million project related to building and services and stuff like that. It's been very fulfilling in that I get to work closely with the Liberian people here for those that are heavily involved in the projects themselves.
Okay.
So we have a HIV/AIDS project within our hospital,
Mm-hmm.
a benevolence project, clearing out debts of people that were in the hospital.
Mm-hmm.
We have housing repair, because we have about 70% of the housing on compound here are national, and they pay a minimal amount of rent.
Okay.
Because they don't get paid a lot.
Yeah.
But we still need to have the places in working order. So that is to get the houses to a certain level and go from there. But essentially, it's supporting the managers of the projects in what they do.
Okay.
And I get to be involved and go out and do photography and write little stories and stuff like that for the reports that we need to do. So that was my official hat.
Right.
But I'm also the orientation facilitator for SIM Liberia. So cultural awareness. I really enjoy getting people's foot in the door, and it makes it easy for them to start their life here in Liberia.
Yeah.
And, response has been positive. So I guess I'm doing an okay job.
That's always encouraging. Yep. So before the call, you mentioned that you're actually coming towards the end of your time, for now at least, there in Liberia. So share a little bit what it looks like, what you're hoping the next steps will be. And obviously your life has been one with a lot of major transition. And I know this type of transition is fairly big as well.
Yeah, so 2015 is when we first came here. But prior to that, we were in Nigeria for a year, which I hadn't shared before, because of Ebola in Liberia. So we will be 9 years in mission, 8 years in Liberia. It ends on January 7th when we head up to England and then over to Australia. The major drive for us is our kids. Our timing for when we were leaving is for our kids.
Yeah.
In January, Scarlett will be starting year 7. Aaron, my second, will be finishing school in Senegal in Dakar Academy in June of next year. So she will stay in Africa for 6 months while the rest of us head back to Australia. And now Lily, she has finished 1 year online of university in Australia.
Yeah.
And she'll be going to live on compound at University of New England. So there's lots of moving parts. And we just feel at this moment it's a good time for us to finish up.
Right.
And see what the Lord has in store for us. It's funny. Sometimes you're like, oh, you stress out about whatever's happening, or things that you can worry about if you want. But why worry about tomorrow? Today has enough of his problems.
That's
kind
right.
of thing. And so job-wise, we know we're going to be okay. We have been blessed by Lauren's grandmother, who has a property in Newcastle, which is close to where Lily is going to be going to university. And so we're going to have rent-free accommodation. So jobs that we get will be to provide basically foodstuffs, electricity, internet, a car, whatever.
Right.
So we don't need to jump straight into basically find any job kind of thing. But we still have reputation for about 6 months. So in January, our home assignment finishes in May. And then we head off in June to Senegal for Aaron's graduation.
Yeah.
And then we all come back as a family after doing a Breathe conference in Switzerland, which is fantastic if you've never gone. I've gone to the men's conference there, but the Breathe conference is specifically for missionaries, and they have specific things there for MKs and adults leaving the field, that kind of stuff. So
wonderful.
In that sense, we all get to finish missions together because we're all flying back to Australia, and it'll be, rather than it's just, oh, Aaron's coming home, we're all doing it.
Yeah. Oh, that's great. Yeah, that sounds like a good way to bring your time of service, at least for now, as a family to an end. So, no, that's great.
Yeah.
I'm going to pause my conversation with Warwick at this point and tune back in next episode to hear a little bit more about what Warwick has seen the Lord doing while serving him in Liberia, as well as some thoughts on missions and how to get involved in that. Thank you so much for listening.
Find us online at missionchats.com